Welcome back to the Real News Network. We're continuing our discussion about the death of Fidel Castro and responding to on-the-street interviews in Cuba. And joining us again is James Early. James was the former director of the Cultural Heritage Policy for Folklife Programs at the Smithsonian Institution, and he's on the board of the Real News Network. Thanks for joining us, James.
Thank you.
So the next clip is with an older guy, it looks like a working class guy in one of the communities, and asking, what comes after Fidel? Are you concerned that this, socialism will be lost? And here's what he says.
No, en este momento no estoy preocupado porque nosotros somos uno solo, somos fiel. Somos fiel.
It's an interesting choice of words at the moment, James. First of all, there was always a certain amount of privilege, both in terms of leadership of the party and certain sectors of the society, like well-known artists and others. Now, to be fair, the difference in terms of the living standard and privilege of that group compared to ordinary people, when you look at other countries, was nothing. I mean, there was a difference, there was a certain level of privilege, but you can't even compare it to the way the elites of all the rest of the Caribbean, or certainly even the American elites, to ordinary people here. But there was a difference. You couldn't just say we are one. But with all these, with this new capitalist forms, they're going to be spontaneously engendering, wealthy people. And if you start having what becomes more like the Chinese model, over time you wind up with millionaires and billionaires, and it's not going to perhaps be at the scale of China. But the idea that we are one is not going to be the same. You're not going to be a society without the same mitigating the class differences. And one of the fights that took place earlier in Cuba, quite a few years ago, there was a big fight about whether now that these partnerships with foreign capital, like over Spanish companies over hotels and some of the other sectors, Canadian companies had come in, is there a need for independent trade unions? That you can no longer say that we are one. There are now, there's going to be a class struggle with the foreign capital will exaggerate. Is there now a discussion, debate about having independent unions, independent mass organizations, independent from the party, so people can organize and fight for their interests?
Well, on the first part of this, yo soy Fidel, I am Fidel, or that we are one, is a historic reflection of nationalism in Cuba, of which Fidel Castro was just the more recent towering expression of that nationalism, of being a common citizenry, which date back to the defeat of Spain. It's always been a very, very nationalist country, so much so that it has not wanted to avow positive racial identification within the country because they thought that would sort of tear the country asunder, and they argued that we are one. So it comes out of that nationalism, and that Fidel Castro was, if he was anything, he was a left-wing nationalist, a follower of Jose Marti, also a follower of Karl Marx, but fundamentally a follower of Jose Marti, to wit, his tomb is right next to that of Jose Marti. So I think this is the expression that you're seeing among ordinary citizens, and it's the pledge that citizens have been asked to take, is to maintain their nationalist independence, self-determination, and sovereignty. That, however, does not obscure the historical fact that's built on the socialist principle, each according to his or her ability, each according to his or her needs, which reflects to you that all individuals are not equal. Now, you may have free healthcare and free access to education, but that does not mean that everybody will come out in cookie-cutter fashion of having the exact same blood pressure, the same heart condition, or the same intellectual propensity with regard to physics or farming. And so that there have always been differentiations in that society, and there will continue to be differentiations in that society. The key issue is to what extent will it be allowed for individual initiative to exploit and go into individualism, and rather than a social individualism. So already there is expressed concern about monopoly. The government has been very clear. It will not allow monopoly. It will not allow super profits, but it does not mean that everybody will be living on the same income or living in the same kind of physical environment. It does mean, though, that there will be a basic minimal standard of a wholesome living environment in terms of one's habitat, in terms of one's access to transportation, in terms of one's access to healthcare and educational needs, and one's access to culture. And I think we have to break with this Western capitalist framework that somehow it's only the Cubans who live in an unequal society, and the implication being that all men, unquote, women in parentheses, are created equal in the United States. And that's just not true. We are not born into equal circumstances, and we face certain barriers in this country as well as every country in the world. The difference in Cuba is that this small country of 11 million people on a planet, I like to say of 7 billion, has done extraordinary things in that natural context, if you will, where there will be these differentials among people in any society to actually achieve a social equity in issues of education and health and culture and national welfare.
Well, I'm raising a specific problem, which is when you get the Cuban government doing joint ventures, and they've been doing, but when it gets even more so on, either with Spanish or perhaps now with American hotel chains and other tourist ventures, and the government is led by the Communist Party. And then you have the trade unions also led by the Communist Party. It's kind of an inherent conflict of interest, and I know there's been a lot of debate about this in Cuba. Did you come across this about now you really need independent trade unions? Otherwise, the party's leading both the joint venture relationship and the union. You get a situation in China, for example. Some of the plants in China that are co-ventures or they are part of this kind of fabric of creating relatively cheap labor to create an export economy. And the Chinese government clamps down on worker organizing, or tries to, in order to keep that kind of economy going. Again, pointing to the need for independent unions.
I've not come across a discussion, but it is one of the primary topics in the month-long tour that I am about to take in Cuba to talk about independent trade unions. My own vantage point is that the key to democracy is that self-organized citizens, and then they send their stewards forward in government, whether they come from the Communist Party or someplace else, but they cannot be conflated into one. So that, yes, I think there is a problem when the civic organizations are a mere extension of a party perspective. And to some extent, there is some indication that that debate is underway, although I cannot say with certainty. But what leads me to consider that that debate is underway, that one of the first pronouncements in 2008 by the new president, Raul Castro, was to challenge the Communist Party in noting to them that you are not the citizenry and you are not the government. And that while the Communist Party is seen as indispensable to the overall direction and security of the country, it is a suggestion that that triad of citizen, party, and government has got to be recalibrated. Another instance would suggest to me that that debate is going on is that Raul Castro has been consistently very critical and very forceful about the pervasive corruption in the country at the highest levels, because there is no middle sector. It goes from government to the citizenry. And there is a huge problem of corruption that the Cubans themselves are openly debating and talking about. And the president consistently raises, and a number of people have been locked up. This suggests to me that there is concern of an over-centralism. It's also within the Communist Party that the Communist Party has taken on itself to direct society rather than to be the steward and the facilitator of society. And the irony is that with this very well-educated population, according to the United Nations, they produce almost nothing until recently these new small enterprise policies came into being. So indications are that this is a discussion and debate going on, but I quite frankly cannot tell you to what level they're going on at this point, and particularly on the fundamental question of organized labor is one that is not just another social question of proactive citizenship, but it is a foundational question both in the construct of socialism, or for that matter, any society. Working people are a key.
Right. Okay, just finally, there's going to be a new president pretty soon. And one thing I found when I was in Cuba, even people I talked to who were extremely critical of the Cuban government, the Cuban Communist Party, Fidel Castro, were almost as critical, or even sometimes more critical, of what they would call the Cuban mafia in Miami. The critique of the Cuban government did not lead them to be pro-American. I guess that has a lot to do with the nationalism and sovereignty you were talking about, desire for sovereignty, but also a real critique and dislike for what was the right-wing factions in Miami. And now they're going to have Donald Trump as the president, and surrounding himself with the far right of the far right in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy. Anyway, we asked, our production company there asked people what they thought of Donald Trump, and everyone said more or less the same thing. Here's a typical answer.
Para mí Trump es un esquizoide. No lo puedo definir de otra forma. Realmente su discurso misógino, racista, intolerante, me parece un paso atrás, 10 pasos atrás en la política de los Estados Unidos hacia el mundo. Lamento lo indecible que el pueblo norteamericano tenga que sufrir 4 años de un cavernícola de esta naturaleza, pero espero que les sirva para crecer en cultura política.
I mean, my guess is this is a pretty typical feeling in Cuba. What are the early signs of whether this might be a change in US-Cuba policy?
Well, certainly there are signs that there will be harsh rhetoric, which is very characteristic of the president-elect Donald Trump. But then we're also beginning to see that harsh rhetoric on a number of topics outside of Cuba is now settling into the realpolitik, where you have within the same party, the same ideology, different perspectives and interests, and so that there will be debates. And in the case of Cuba, one of the things that I think we have to focus on is that the accords between President Raul Castro and President Barack Obama have gone a fair piece down the road in which there is a lot of capital already in play. There are already U.S. hotel companies renovating, for example, the oldest hotel, the Inglaterra, in the capital of Cuba, Havana, and there are other joint ventures already in play. There's already in play interdiction, the postal exchange, Coast Guard exchange. There is a U.S. Coast Guard office in Cuba that works on a daily basis with the Cuban Coast Guard in terms of potential oil spills, security of people at sea, and the interdiction of drugs. So there is a real politic underway, and that the Donald Trump administration will have to intersect that reality. When you look at the fact that the head of the Chamber of Commerce went down to Cuba almost 2 years before this accord on the establishment of diplomatic relations, and that other entities have been selling Cuba about $500 million worth of food, cash on the battle, chicken wings and vegetables coming down the Mississippi River, or the delegations from Mobile, Alabama, and Tampa, Florida, competing who's going to have access to Cuba and who will have a consul, since in Miami they don't want it. These are real social political factors into which Trump now steps, and he will not be able to dictate on all counts. So yes, there will be harsh rhetoric, and there will be some hard times, but the Cubans have demonstrated over half a century that not only are they very resistant, they are also very shrewd negotiators. So I think that the fundamental elements of these accords will be maintained. Finally, with regard to Cubans in Miami, there is no one group of Cubans in Miami. The most recent social science studies done by Cuban Americans from institutions, educational institutions in Miami, notes the multi-generational dimensions of Cuban American citizens and new immigrants, and notes the different sensibilities and outlooks and different levels of intensities of what they feel about Cuba. And the fact is that the right wing has lost ground both in its voting potential to elect a president of the United States from their own from the right-wing community, and has lost ground in being able to prevent Cubans from going back and forth. So you've got people like Rubio, who wants to get rid of the wet foot, dry foot policy, because so many Cubans come to the U.S. for economic reasons, not ideological or political reasons. Once they get here, they get full access, they're able to earn money, and they're able to travel back and forth as often as they want to, have the resources to. And so they're being able to take material goods and money back and forth to Cuba and taking advantage of this right-wing proposition, although they may not be anti-socialist or anti-Castro Cubans themselves. So it is a complex situation into which Trump steps, and we have to follow and engage the realpolitik, and I would caution on over-speculation.
All right, thanks very much for joining us, James.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.